Dead America, Tales from Las Vegas, Sin City Reborn, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Kyle led the group down the center of the street, his boots falling quiet on the asphalt. The road stretched ahead of them clean and empty, flanked on both sides by low commercial buildings that sat dark and still. This part of town had already been swept by patrols earlier in the week, and the absence of movement on the street confirmed it. No shambling figures in the intersections, no sound drifting out from broken storefronts. Just the quiet that came when the work had already been done. Damon walked to his left, a few steps back, carrying a length of steel pipe across one shoulder. Hiroshi moved ahead of the group on point, his spear held low and ready, his eyes sweeping the sidewalks and doorways with steady attention. Behind them, 3 civilians followed in a loose formation, each of them armed with improvised weapons and wearing the layered protection that had become standard for clearing operations. Magazine armor on the forearms, heavy jackets cinched tight, gloves. They had parked the vehicles a block back, standard protocol now. Engine noise carried too far in a city this quiet, and there was no sense announcing their arrival to anything that might still be moving inside the building ahead. The hotel sat at the end of the block, a plain-looking structure that rose 4 stories above the street. It was the kind of place that catered to business travelers and convention overflow. Nothing flashy, nothing that would have drawn a second look before the world fell apart. It had been skipped during the main push because it sat well off the strip and was never a priority. But now, 70 days in, it was the last hotel on the list, and Kyle intended to check it off. He stopped the group about 50 yards out and studied the building. The windows were dark, every one of them. No shadows shifting behind the glass, no faces pressed against it. But there were signs. Ground floor windows had furniture pushed up against them from the inside, visible through the gaps where blinds hung crooked. On the upper floors, fabric had been hung in several of the windows. Sheets, maybe towels. Whether they had been signals or makeshift curtains was hard to say, but the material had faded and gone limp with time. Whatever those coverings had been meant to communicate, it had been weeks ago. "Those barricades look old," Kyle said. "Whatever happened in there, it happened a while back." Damon looked at the building, taking his time with it. He shifted the pipe from one shoulder to the other and let out a slow breath. "These late ones always feel different," Damon said. "Used to be every building was a hornet's nest. Now it's more like archaeology, figuring out what happened to people instead of fighting through them." Kyle nodded. That was about right. The early days had been a different kind of work entirely, breaching hotels packed wall to wall with ghouls, fighting through stairwells and hallways with nowhere to retreat. Those first few weeks had been about survival and speed. This was something else, slower, quieter, and somehow heavier. Hiroshi turned back to the group and held up a closed fist, then pointed toward a side entrance where the door stood slightly ajar. He looked at Kyle and waited. "That's our way in," Kyle said. Standard sweep, floor by floor, room by room. Hiroshi on point. Hiroshi gave a short nod and moved toward the entrance, the group falling in behind him. The side door opened into a narrow hallway that led to the main lobby. Kyle could smell it before they got there. The stale, heavy air of a building that had been sealed for weeks, layered with something worse underneath. They had all gotten used to it by now, but the first breath inside a new building always hit different. The lobby opened up before them, and the first thing Kyle noticed was that it had been organized. The furniture was wrong, all of it pulled out of position and arranged with purpose. A couch and 2 heavy armchairs had been dragged to block the front entrance. A luggage cart sat on its side, wedged into the gap between the front desk and the wall. Someone had thought this through. Someone had fought to hold this space. Hiroshi cleared the corners of the lobby with quick, efficient movements, his spear tracking each doorway as he passed it. He signaled clear, and the group moved in. They found the first ghoul in the hallway behind the front desk. It was wedged between a vending machine and the wall, still moving, but barely. Its legs had given out a long time ago, and it was pulling itself along the floor with one arm, the other bent at an angle that said it had been broken before the thing had died the first time. Hiroshi put his spear through its skull without breaking stride, and the movement stopped. 2 more were in the ground floor conference room, standing in the dark near the windows. Slow, directionless, turning toward the sound of the door opening with the sluggish delay of creatures that had been wearing down for over 2 months. Kyle and one of the civilians handled them quickly, and the room went still. They moved to the stairwell and started up. The pattern repeated on the second floor. A handful of ghouls, scattered and slow, most of them trapped in rooms where the doors had swung shut behind them. The team cleared each one methodically, checking every bathroom, every closet, every space large enough to hold a body. But it was the other things they found that told the real story. Bodies of ghouls with head wounds from blunt objects, laid out in hallways where someone had dragged them after putting them down. Improvised weapons left behind, a fire extinguisher with its base caved in, a curtain rod sharpened to a rough point. In one room, a dresser had been shoved against the door from the inside, the bed frame broken apart and reassembled into something that might have worked as a barricade. No one was inside, just the evidence that someone had been there and had eventually moved on. The third floor was the same, but the ghouls were fewer. By the time they reached the fourth floor, the hallway was almost entirely clear. Doors stood propped open with shoes and wedges, rooms already emptied of anything dangerous. Ghouls had been dragged to the end of the hall and stacked against the wall, their skulls bearing the marks of whatever had been used to put them down. The work was rough but thorough. Whoever had done this had known what they were doing, or had learned fast enough that the difference didn't matter. "Someone cleared this floor already," Damon said. "Did a damn decent job of it too." Kyle looked down the hallway at the stacked bodies, counting them. 8, maybe 10. That was real work for people without proper weapons or training. He felt something settle in his chest that he had felt before on jobs like this. Respect, mixed with the weight of knowing that respect existed because people had been forced into something no one should have had to face. They reached the stairwell door to the top floor and found it blocked, not casually, but seriously. Heavy furniture had been wedged against it from the other side, stacked and braced in a way that said the people behind it had no intention of anything getting through. Kyle stepped up to the door and knocked on the frame, firm but measured. "My name is Kyle, and we're working with Captain Foster in clearing the city. If there is anybody alive in there, know that we are here to help." Silence. Then the sound of something scraping against the floor, slow and cautious. A voice came through, muffled by the barricade. "How do we know that's true?" "You don't," Kyle said. "But if we were anything else, we wouldn't be knocking." Another pause. Then the scraping started again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of furniture being dragged away from the door. It took a full minute before the barricade cleared enough for the door to open. The man standing on the other side looked like he hadn't slept in a month. He was somewhere in his 40s, thin in the way people got when food had been short for a while, but his eyes were sharp and his posture said he was still holding himself together. He looked past Kyle at the group behind him, studying the weapons and armor, doing his own assessment before he made a decision. Then he stepped back and let them through. "I'm Peter," he said. "There's 6 of us up here." Kyle extended his hand and Peter shook it. The grip was firm despite everything. "How long have you all been up here?" Kyle asked. "Weeks, lost count after a while," Peter said. "We were guests and staff when everything went to hell. A few of us banded together in the first couple of days and started working our way up, floor by floor, clearing as we went." He paused, and the pause said more than the words that followed. "We lost people along the way," Peter said. Kyle nodded. He didn't ask for details. He didn't have to, because it was a story that had played out for everyone who was still standing. Peter led them through a short hallway into a penthouse suite that had been converted into a living space. 5 other people were inside, spread across the room in various states of rest. A woman sat near the window with a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. An older couple occupied one of the couches. A man, roughly Peter's age, sat at the kitchen counter, watching the newcomers with tired but alert eyes. They all had the look that came after weeks of surviving on whatever was left, knowing help might never come. "We worked through the hotel's kitchen stores first, then the mini bars and vending machines on every floor we could get to," Peter said. "We're running low on just about everything." "There are still some rooms with ghouls locked inside," Kyle said. "Ones you couldn't get to?" "A few. Doors we didn't want to open without more bodies to back us up," Peter said. "We could hear them moving around in there for the first few weeks. Some of them have gone quiet, but I'm not betting on them being gone." "We'll mark those and get a follow-up team out here to handle them," Kyle said. Peter's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension releasing in a way that said he had been carrying it for a long time. The woman by the window let out a breath that might have been a sob if she had let it go further, but she held it, pressing her hand against her mouth. Kyle stepped to the side and keyed his radio. "Base, this is Kyle. We've completed the sweep on the last hotel. Building is mostly clear. We've got 6 survivors on the top floor, all in stable condition but low on supplies. Going to need transport and a few extra hands. We still have some rooms left to clear." The radio crackled back with a confirmation, the voice on the other end steady and routine. This was what the end of the clearing looked like. Not desperate rescues under fire, not fighting through swarms in casino hallways. Just the methodical, unglamorous work of finding everyone who was left and bringing them in. Kyle finished the call and turned back to Peter. "We'll get you all moved someplace safe and get some real food in you," Kyle said. Peter looked at the others in the room. The woman by the window was crying now, quietly. The young man beside her holding her shoulder. The older couple had reached for each other's hands. The man at the counter just closed his eyes and lowered his head. "Thank you," Peter said. Kyle walked to the penthouse windows and looked out. The city stretched below him, wide and still. The skyline scarred but standing. From up here he could see the roads cutting through the commercial district, empty and swept clean by the patrols that ran their routes every day. Further out, he could make out the faint shapes of vehicles moving on a distant road. A supply convoy or a clearing team headed somewhere else. This was the last hotel on the list. Every structure they had flagged, every building that might hold survivors or ghouls or both, had now been reached. There was still work to do, rooms to clear, buildings to inventory, people to account for. The list of what came next was long enough to fill a notebook. But this part, the part where they went looking for people who had been waiting in the dark for someone to come, was done. Kyle let himself sit with that for a moment. Then he turned away from the window and got back to work. Chapter 2. Foster and Hansen walked the main road that cut through Nellis Air Force Base, the open tarmac stretching wide to their left, where a pair of supply trucks sat being loaded by a crew of civilians. The base had changed, not in any single dramatic way, but in the kind of accumulation that happened when enough days passed and enough people showed up with enough purpose. Where it had once felt like a captured installation being figured out on the fly, it now carried the weight of something more permanent. A command center with roots going down. People moved through the base with direction. Work crews were organizing in one of the hangars, stacking crates and sorting materials onto pallets that would be loaded onto flatbeds and driven into the city. Across the tarmac, a group of civilian volunteers had taken over a repurposed maintenance building and turned it into an inventory station. Boxes and bins lined up along folding tables, while a woman with a clipboard moved between them, checking labels, calling out numbers to a man who wrote them down in a spiral notebook. Near the barracks, someone was putting up a bulletin board against the side of the building, hammering nails into a sheet of plywood, while a few handwritten notices fluttered in the breeze, already pinned to the surface. Foster caught a glimpse of the writing on one as they passed. Someone looking for a family member, someone else offering to teach carpentry skills, a third asking if anyone had found a calico cat. Further down, a handful of kids were chasing each other across an open stretch of concrete near one of the smaller buildings. Their laughter carried across the base in a way that stopped Foster for half a step, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in the world they had been living in, and hearing it out here in the open felt like something he wasn't sure how to process. One of the kids stumbled and went down on her hands, then popped right back up and kept running without missing a beat. A woman sitting on the steps of the building nearby watched them with the tired but present attention of someone who had been keeping those children alive for a long time. Hansen noticed it too, but didn't comment on it. He just watched them for a moment and then kept walking. They reached a staging area near one of the larger hangars where a civilian coordinator named Webb was standing over a map spread across the hood of a truck. Webb was a lean man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who had been running logistics long before the world required it. A couple of team leads stood near him, both of them holding water bottles and looking like they had just come in from the field. Webb looked up as Foster and Hansen approached. "Captain," Webb said. "How are we looking?" Foster asked. Webb tapped the map with the end of a pencil. Sections of the city had been shaded in, some with solid color and others with cross-hatching. Foster could read the system at a glance. Solid meant cleared. Cross-hatched meant partially cleared or in progress. Everything else was untouched. We're sitting at roughly 30% of structures cleared, Webb said. Most of that is residential. Houses, smaller apartment complexes, the kind of places where a team of 4 or 5 can get through in a day. The bigger targets are going to be another story. How much bigger? Hansen asked. Each major hotel is a multi-day operation on its own. You're talking hundreds of rooms, multiple floors, convention spaces, kitchens, storage areas. Some of them have underground parking structures that haven't been touched. And that's just the hotels. We've still got large commercial buildings, warehouses, and a few shopping centers that nobody has set foot in yet, Webb said. One of the team leads shifted his weight and spoke up. We're also running into situations where buildings that were marked clear a few weeks ago are popping up with activity again. Doors that were closed but not secured. Ghouls that were stuck in rooms where the doors finally gave out. We had a team last week respond to a report on a house that had been cleared 10 days earlier. Found 3 of them wandering around the kitchen. Foster took that in. It was the kind of problem that was going to keep repeating until every building in the city had been gone through with enough thoroughness that nothing got left behind. And even then, there would be surprises. There were always surprises. Manage as best you can, Foster said. Once we get through the initial sweep, I want every team to have another team backing them up. Every building gets swept twice, and is only checked off if both teams clear it out. We've come this far, it would be a shame to lose it because somebody missed one of those things hiding in a closet. The team lead nodded. We've been doing some of that on the fly, but I'll start making plans for something more concrete. Foster studied the map for a moment, his eyes moving across the unshaded sections. There was a lot of white left. How are we looking on the food supply front? Foster asked. Webb pulled the glasses down from his forehead and looked at the map through them, already running the calculation in his head. I have dedicated teams whose only job is to clear out grocery stores. I have secondary teams focusing on less promising potentials, like restaurants and distribution warehouses. We're making good progress on that front, but it's slowing down the residential sweeps, Webb said. I know, but we need to know exactly what we have before winter gets here. If we don't have a full picture of what's available in this city, we can't plan distribution, and we can't set rations with any confidence. I'd rather slow down the sweep and know where we stand on food than clear every house on the east side and find out in December that we're short, Foster said. I'll work on it and keep you posted, Webb said. Appreciate it, Foster said. He and Hansen moved on, leaving Webb and his people to the maps. They walked past a row of vehicles that had been lined up for maintenance, hoods up and parts spread on tarps beside them. Keeping the fleet running was its own operation. Every truck, every bus, every vehicle they used for patrols and supply runs took fuel and parts, and the pool of people who knew how to work on engines was smaller than Foster would have liked. But they managed. People stepped up and learned what needed learning, which had been the story of the past 2 months in just about every area. The smell of something cooking hit them as they passed a building that had been converted into a communal kitchen. It was simple, probably canned soup or rice or something pulled from a hotel pantry and stretched to feed as many mouths as possible. A man stood at the entrance propping the door open with a cinder block, steam rolling out past him into the open air. He nodded to Foster and Hansen as they passed. Smells almost like real food, Hansen said. Give it a few months. Once the farms start producing, it might actually be real food, Foster said. They continued down the road, walking the same easy pace they had been keeping since they started. The rhythm of it had a quality that felt unfamiliar. 2 men just walking and talking without a destination that involved danger. It was the kind of thing that would have been unremarkable 2 months ago, and now felt like something worth noticing. Hansen walked in silence for a stretch, his hands in his pockets, looking around at the base like he was trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been carrying in his head for the past 10 weeks. You know what's strange? Hansen asked. What's that? Foster asked. Walking around without expecting something to come around the corner and try to eat me. I keep catching myself scanning windows and doorways like we're still out there. That's not a bad habit to keep, Foster said. Maybe not, But it'd be nice to just walk somewhere and think about lunch instead of worrying about becoming it. Foster let out a short breath through his nose, close enough to a laugh. We're a long way from that, Hanson. The streets might be clear, but 70% of the buildings in this city still haven't been touched. All it takes is one door giving out in the wrong place at the wrong time. I know, Hanson said. I'm not saying let the guard down. I'm just saying it's weird to feel something other than pure survival mode for the first time in 2 months. Foster understood that. The shift was real, even if he wasn't ready to trust it fully. For weeks, every day had been built around the same calculation. How many ghouls could they move? How many people could they reach? How many hours of daylight did they have left? The urgency had been constant, a drumbeat underneath everything they did. Now the drumbeat had slowed, and in its place was something that felt almost like routine. Supply runs instead of rescue missions. Inventory counts instead of body counts. It was better. It was also fragile, and Foster knew better than anyone that fragile things broke when you stopped paying attention to them. They passed the communications building where a pair of soldiers sat outside on folding chairs, one of them cleaning a sidearm, while the other read from a paperback that had seen better days. Both men nodded as Foster and Hanson walked by. A few buildings further, a mechanic had the hood up on a truck and was leaning into the engine bay with a wrench, a portable radio sitting on a toolbox beside him, playing Midnight Mike's broadcast at low volume. The familiar sound of Mike's voice drifted past them, calm and steady, giving updates about supply distribution points and patrol schedules. The broadcast had evolved from its early days of desperate calls into something closer to a community bulletin, and hearing it play casually out of a radio in a mechanic's bay said something about how far they had come. From somewhere across the base, the sound of an engine broke through the ambient noise. Foster heard it before he saw it, the low rumble of a truck moving faster than the usual supply vehicles. He and Hanson both turned toward the sound. A pickup came down the main road and pulled to a stop about 20 feet from where they stood. The driver's side door swung open and Parker stepped out, moving with a quickness that Foster recognized. It wasn't alarm. Parker's face didn't carry the tension of a man delivering bad news. But there was urgency in it, the kind that said something had come up, and it wasn't going to wait around while people finished their walk. "Cap, Sarge," Parker said. "You're going to want to get in." "What's going on?" Foster asked. "Something you need to see for yourself." "Trust me, it's worth the drive," Parker said. Foster looked at Hanson. Hanson looked back, gave a small shrug that said he was game for whatever it was, and the two of them walked to the truck. Hanson climbed into the back seat, while Foster pulled himself into the passenger side. The door had barely closed before Parker dropped it into gear and pulled out, the tires grabbing the pavement as they headed for the base exit. Foster settled into the seat and watched the base pass by through the window. People were still working, still moving, still building something out of what was left. Whatever Parker needed to show him, the work here would keep going without him. That alone was something worth sitting with. The truck turned onto the road beyond the gate and headed northeast, the base shrinking in the side mirror behind them. Chapter 3. Parker drove them northeast through the city, the truck rolling at a steady pace along roads that had been cleared and maintained by the patrol teams. The urban density of the inner city gave way gradually as they moved, the packed commercial buildings and apartment complexes thinning out into wider lots and lower structures. Strip malls sat empty, their parking lots still holding scattered vehicles that nobody had gotten around to moving yet. A patrol vehicle passed them going the other direction, the driver raising a hand through the window as they went by. Foster watched the transition through the passenger window. The further they got from the core of the city, the more the landscape opened up. Buildings gave way to fenced lots and open ground, the kind of flat, sun-baked terrain that stretched for miles without anything tall enough to cast a shadow. It was a different world out here. Open sky in every direction, the land laid bare under a sun that had nothing to compete with. After weeks of fighting in hallways and stairwells and hotel rooms where the walls were always close enough to touch, all that open space made Foster feel exposed in a way that he recognized as irrational but couldn't quite shake. The roads out here were in decent shape. The patrol teams had pushed most of the abandoned vehicles to the shoulders over the past few weeks, opening up the lanes for supply convoys and clearing operations. A few of the intersections had been marked with spray-painted symbols on the pavement, a system the patrol teams had developed to communicate road conditions and building status to anyone passing through. Green circle meant clear. Red X meant avoid. Foster had seen the system evolve from a few random marks into something organized and consistent, another example of people building structure out of necessity. In the distance, a work crew was visible on the shoulder of a road, doing something to a stretch of fencing. Foster couldn't tell whether they were repairing it or repurposing it for something else, but the fact that people were out here working was enough. "How'd you find this place?" Foster asked. One of the patrol teams ran into a guy on the road a couple weeks back. Said he had a ranch background and had been working some land out here since before we even showed up. Turns out there were a few of them, people who had farming or landscaping experience who had found each other and just started growing things. Nobody told them to. They just did it, Parker said. "That's how it works," Hansen said from the back seat. "People find what they're good at and get to it." Parker slowed the truck as they approached a turnoff, then pulled onto a dirt road that led toward a cluster of low structures and open fields. The land here had been worked. Rows were visible in the soil, neat and deliberate, stretching across several acres of ground that someone had cleared, tilled, and planted with the kind of effort that said they meant for it to last. Further back, a fenced area held a small herd of cattle, maybe a dozen head, standing in the shade of a metal lean-to that looked like it had been built from materials pulled off a construction site. A makeshift irrigation system ran along one edge of the fields. PVC pipe and garden hoses connected in a network that ran back toward what Foster assumed was a water source tied to the Lake Mead system. People were working. A group of 5 or 6 were moving through the rows, bent at the waist, doing the kind of hands-in-the-dirt labor that no amount of planning could replace. Others were carrying tools and buckets between the structures. Near the cattle pen, a man was mending a section of fence with wire and pliers, his movements unhurried and focused. Parker pulled the truck to a stop near the edge of the main field, and the 3 of them climbed out. The air smelled different out here, dirt and manure and something green underneath it, the kind of smell that came from things growing. After months of breathing nothing but dust and decay and the stale air of sealed buildings, it hit different. A woman separated from the group working the rows and walked over to meet them. She was stocky and weathered, somewhere in her 50s, with calloused hands and the kind of direct eye contact that said she didn't have time for anything that wasn't useful. Behind her, a younger man followed, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Captain Foster," the woman said. "I'm Ruth. Parker said you'd be coming out." "What you've got going here is impressive," Foster said. "It's a start," Ruth said. "Come on, I'll walk you through it." She led them along the edge of the main field, gesturing as she talked. The younger man, who she introduced as Eli, fell in beside them and added details when Ruth left gaps. The 2 of them had the rhythm of people who had been working closely together long enough to finish each other's explanations. "Right now, we're putting winter crops in the ground," Ruth said. "Root vegetables mostly. Turnips, carrots, beets, some hardy greens, kale, collards, things that can handle the cooler months. The desert climate is tricky, but this area has more potential than people think, especially if you've got water." "And you've got water?" Foster asked. "We've got access to the system that feeds off Lake Mead. As long as that holds, we can irrigate. Eli rigged up most of what you see here," Ruth said. Eli shrugged like it wasn't worth mentioning. "Mostly just PVC and gravity," Eli said. "It's not fancy, but it gets water where it needs to go." They walked further, past the vegetable rows, to an area where the ground had been leveled and framing materials were stacked. Ruth pointed at it. "This is where the greenhouses are going. We've got a team from the stadium, Captain Brooks' people, who are helping with construction. The frames are being built from steel and aluminum pulled from garden centers and hardware stores. Glass and plastic sheeting from wherever we can find it. Once those are up, we can grow things that would never make it in open desert. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs. Extend the growing season past what the outdoor fields can handle," Ruth said. "How long until they're operational?" Foster asked. "First one could be up in a few weeks if the materials keep coming. After that, maybe one every week or 2, depending on manpower," Ruth said. Foster nodded. The greenhouses were the long play, and he understood their importance. The outdoor fields would produce, but they were at the mercy of the climate. The greenhouses gave them control, and control was everything when you were trying to feed a city. They reached the cattle pen and stopped at the fence. The animals stood in their loose cluster, unbothered by the visitors. A man nearby was filling a water trough from a hose, the water splashing against the metal sides. 12 head, Ruth said. Found them on a ranch about 15 miles out. Took us 2 days to get them here. There's talk of going back out for more, but that's a project for later. Right now, these animals are more valuable alive than they are as food. Breeding stock, milk, once we get a few of them producing. Down the line, we'll have enough to start thinking about meat, but that's months away at the earliest. Parker had been listening with the quiet attention of someone running calculations. He spoke up as they turned away from the pen and walked back toward the main field. How much land can you realistically work with the people you've got? Parker asked. What you see here, plus maybe another 5 or 6 acres with the people we have here. With some more hands and some protective infrastructure, we could triple that by the time the spring planting season rolls around, Ruth said. What do you need? Parker asked. Any tools you can find us, plus fertilizer. Really just the basics. We've scrounged what we can, but half of what we're using is held together with tape and stubbornness, Ruth said. What about some machinery? I'm pretty sure there's some farm supply stores in town, Foster asked. That would make life easy, however, unless you boys know of some fuel deliveries coming in. I don't think it's a long-term solution, Ruth said with a smirk. The soldiers joined in with a chuckle of their own, nodding in agreement. Any security issues out here? Parker asked. Ruth exchanged a glance with Eli before answering. The patrols have kept the area clean for the most part. We get the occasional straggler wandering through, but nothing we can't handle. That said, we're a long way from the wall out here, and at night it gets quiet in a way that makes you think about what could come walking out of the dark. A permanent security presence would go a long way toward letting people sleep better, Ruth said. I'll get a patrol team up here tonight, and I'll get my people working on a more permanent solution, Foster said. How long before we're seeing real harvests? Parker asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment, doing the math. Honestly, you're looking at a couple of months before anything significant comes in from the outdoor fields. The winter crops are hardy, but they still need time. The greenhouses will speed things up once they're built and planted, but that's another few weeks on top of construction. Foster nodded as he looked out across the field. People were still working the rows, still bending and digging and planting, with the steady patience of a job that didn't care about urgency. The food wasn't going to grow faster because the situation demanded it. It would grow at the pace the soil and the water and the sun allowed, and everything else would have to adjust around that reality. It was the kind of problem that couldn't be solved with a plan or a weapon. It could only be solved with time and effort, and both of those were in shorter supply than anyone wanted to admit. His radio crackled to life, breaking the quiet. Foster, you there? It's Mike. Foster keyed the radio. Go ahead, Mike. I'm ready to head over to the stadium whenever you are. Brooks says the conference setup is good to go. Just need to know when you're coming, Mike said. We'll be on the road in 5 minutes, Foster said. Copy that. See you there, Mike said. Foster turned back to Ruth and extended his hand. Keep this going. Whatever you need, you get word to us, and we'll do what we can, Foster said. Ruth shook his hand with a grip that matched her demeanor. Just keep sending people and materials. We'll take care of the rest, Ruth said. The three of them walked back to the truck. Parker climbed behind the wheel while Hanson pulled open the rear door. Foster paused for a moment before getting in, looking back at the fields one more time. The rows of turned earth, the irrigation lines catching the light, the cattle standing in their pen, the people working. 2 months ago, this land had been empty scrub on the outskirts of a dying city. Now, it was the most important piece of ground in Las Vegas. Hanson settled into the back seat and pulled the door shut. Never thought I'd care so much about turnips, Hanson said. Foster chuckled as he climbed in, getting situated before Parker pulled the truck onto the road, heading toward the stadium. Chapter 4. They picked up Mike at a relay point on the north side of the city, a gas station that one of the patrol teams had turned into a rest stop and message hub. Mike was standing outside when they pulled up, a backpack slung over one shoulder and a folded map sticking out of the side pocket. He looked like a man who had been busy, but was holding up, the kind of tired that came from working long hours on something that mattered, rather than the bone-deep exhaustion that had defined the early weeks. He climbed into the back seat next to Hanson, pulling the door shut behind him and settling in. "Good to see you, boys," Mike said. "How's the broadcast going?" Foster asked. "Busy. We've shifted the format over the past couple of weeks. Less emergency calls, more community updates, supply distribution schedules, patrol routes, work crew assignments. People are actually tuning in for information now instead of just comfort. It feels different," Mike said. "That's because it is different," Hanson said. "It is," Mike said. "But I'll tell you what caught me off guard. People have started sending in requests. Not music requests, though I get those too. They're asking me to read names. People looking for family, friends, co-workers. They want me to put the names out on the air in case someone recognizes them. I've been reading about 30 a day." The truck was quiet for a moment. 30 names a day, every day, from people still looking for someone. The math behind that was the kind of thing nobody wanted to think about too hard. "You keeping a list?" Foster asked. "Becky at the stadium has been helping me organize them, cross-referencing against the survivor registries as they come in. We've had a few matches already, not many, but a few," Mike said. Parker pulled back onto the road and headed south, picking up the outer loop that ran along the perimeter of the city. This was the route the supply convoys used, a wide road that traced the edge of the habitable zones and connected the major operational sites. It kept traffic off the interior streets, which made life easier for the patrol teams working the neighborhoods. The drive was smooth, the road having been cleared early on as a priority route. Abandoned vehicles that had once clogged the lanes had been pushed to the shoulders or towed to staging areas where they were stripped for parts or added to the perimeter wall. The wall came into view about a mile in. Foster had seen it before, but each time carried a different weight. What had started as a desperate improvisation in the early weeks had grown into one of the most significant engineering efforts of the entire operation. The perimeter wall stretched ahead of them in a long, unbroken line, built almost entirely from vehicles. Cars, trucks, SUVs, vans, all of them pushed bumper to bumper in a continuous barrier that followed the outer boundary of the secured zones. They had cleared every car lot in the city to make this happen, every dealership, every used car operation, every fleet yard. And when that wasn't enough, they had pulled vehicles from residential driveways, parking garages, and hotel lots to fill the gaps. The sheer number of cars it had taken was staggering, and seeing them lined up like this, stretching into the distance in both directions, gave the effort a scale that was hard to fully absorb. Recent improvements were visible as they drove along the wall's interior side. Metal sheeting had been welded and bolted to the outward-facing surfaces of the vehicles, turning what had been a line of cars into something closer to an actual fortification. The sheets covered the gaps between vehicles, the open windows, the spaces beneath the frames. It wasn't seamless, and in places the work was rough, but it was solid. The hoods of the cars along the top of the wall had been left accessible, their flat surfaces serving as elevated platforms where defenders could climb up and look out over the barrier. From up there, a person could see a good distance across the open ground beyond the perimeter, which was the point. Foster studied the wall as they passed, his eyes moving along the sections with the attention of someone who was always looking for what still needed to be done. "We need to brace the tires," Foster said. Parker glanced over. "What do you mean?" "If a large enough group pushes against this wall from the outside, the vehicles are going to slide. I know they were working on it on the north side of town, but we need to get that done everywhere, sooner rather than later." "I can pull a couple of patrol teams and put them on it if you want," Hanson said. Foster contemplated the offer for a moment, ultimately shaking his head. "No. No, I don't want to do that. We don't have enough patrol teams as it is," Foster said. The vehicle fell quiet for a few minutes before Mike sat up, speaking with excitement. "What about the retirement home?" The soldiers let out a laugh before Hanson responded. "You want to put Grandma to work with a welder?" "No, but if they were anything like my grandmother, they could spot a troublemaker from 100 yards. I've had several call into the station, begging to do something. I think they can manage keeping watch on the line in spots where we don't have enough people," Mike said. Hanson and Foster exchanged a glance, followed by a shrug of the shoulders. "I've heard worse ideas, Cap," Hanson said. "All right, Mike, let's get that set up." Foster said, as he made the next turn, running along the south side of the city. Guards were posted at intervals along the wall, stationed on the elevated platforms or standing at ground level near sections that had been designated as watch points. They were a mix of soldiers and armed civilians, most of them carrying rifles or shotguns, a few with binoculars hanging from their necks. They looked alert, but not tense. The watch had become routine, another shift in the daily rhythm of the operation. One of the guards raised a hand as the truck passed, and Foster returned it. The stadium appeared ahead of them as they rounded a long curve in the road. It was massive, the kind of structure that dominated the landscape from every angle. From the outside, it looked largely untouched, its exterior surfaces clean and intact, the architecture carrying the confident permanence of something built to last. It had been locked down tight since early in the outbreak. Captain Brooks and his people had been inside this whole time, operating independently of Foster's group, running their own operation within the stadium's walls, while Foster's teams worked the city around them. The two groups had cooperated over the past weeks, sharing information and resources where it made sense, but they had been running on parallel tracks. This meeting was about bringing those tracks together. Parker followed the perimeter road around to the loading dock entrance on the far side of the building. The main entrances were sealed, heavy barriers visible behind the glass doors, and the loading dock was the only controlled access point. A checkpoint had been set up at the dock entrance, 2 armed guards standing at a gate made from welded steel pipe and chain link. One of them stepped forward as Parker brought the truck to a stop. The guard checked their names against a list on a clipboard, spoke briefly into a radio, and then waved them through. The gate swung open and Parker pulled the truck into the loading dock area, the interior dim and cool after the open road. "They run a tighter ship than you run at Nellis," Mike said. "It's a different world over here, Mike. Brooks has his orders, and it's taken a near act of God to get him to relax. Just be thankful they're letting us in the door," Foster said. They climbed out of the truck and were met almost before their boots hit the concrete. A man in military fatigues walked toward them from the interior of the dock, his stride measured and precise. Captain Daniel Brooks was the kind of officer whose appearance communicated everything you needed to know about how he ran things. His uniform was clean, his posture was squared, and his expression carried the controlled calm of someone who kept a tight schedule and expected the people around him to do the same. He was older than Foster by a few years, with close-cropped gray at the temples and the lean build of a man who had stayed in shape through discipline rather than necessity. A woman walked beside him, carrying a tablet and a folder. Becky moved with the efficient attention of someone who kept the details organized so that her commanding officer didn't have to. She nodded to the group as they approached, but let Brooks do the talking. "Captain Foster," Brooks said, extending his hand. "Captain Brooks," Foster said, shaking it. "Appreciate you setting this up." "It's overdue," Brooks said. "We've been running our own show in here for weeks, and you've been running yours out there. It's time we got everyone in the same room." He gestured for them to follow, and the group fell in behind him and Becky as they moved through the loading dock and into the interior of the stadium. The hallways were wide and well lit, powered by the same electrical grid that kept the rest of the city running. The deeper they went, the more signs of life appeared. A doorway opened to a room where folding cots were set up in neat rows, personal belongings arranged on small tables beside each one. Another revealed a storage area stacked with boxes of food and water, the inventory marked with labels in neat handwriting. Voices echoed from somewhere further inside, the sound of people going about daily business. They passed an open area that had been set up as a classroom of sorts. A woman stood at a whiteboard teaching a group of about a dozen adults. The writing on the board too far away to read clearly, but the setup unmistakable. Education hadn't stopped just because the world had. Whether it was practical skills, medical training, or something else entirely, people were learning. Further along, a pair of men carried a stretcher frame between them, headed somewhere with purpose. The medical operation Brooks was running inside the stadium had its own infrastructure, its own staff, its own protocols. Foster was getting a clearer picture of just how self-contained this place had become. Brooks hadn't just been keeping people alive in here, he had been building a community. Brooks led them through a series of turns and up a flight of stairs to a conference room that overlooked the interior of the stadium. The room had been set up with a long table, chairs enough for the group, and a phone system at the center of the table with a speaker and several lines already connected. A large map of the city was pinned to the wall behind the table, marked with the same color coding system Foster had seen on Webb's map at Nellis, though this version had additional notations that reflected Brooks's own intelligence on the city's status. Becky moved to the phone system and began checking connections while Brooks directed the group to their seats. Foster took a chair at the center of the table. Hanson sat to his right, Parker to his left. Mike settled in at the end, pulling his folded map from his backpack and spreading it on the table in front of him. We've got team leads from 3 sectors on the line, plus a couple of coordinators from the medical and supply operations, Brooks said. Everyone should be connected within the next few minutes. The speaker on the phone system crackled, and a voice came through confirming a connection. Then another. Becky checked each one off on her tablet and gave Brooks a nod. Brooks looked around the table, then at Foster. "Your show, Captain," Brooks said. Foster leaned forward and rested his forearms on the table. "All right, let's get into it." Chapter 5. The conference call connection steadied, the initial static giving way to the clear hum of open lines. Becky confirmed the last of them with a nod to Brooks, and the room settled into the particular quiet that came before a meeting that everyone knew was going to be heavy. Foster looked around the table. Hanson sat with his arms crossed, his expression neutral but attentive. Parker leaned forward with his forearms on the table, already focused. Mike had his map spread out in front of him, a pen resting on top of it. Brooks sat across from Foster, his posture upright, a notepad and pen arranged with the precision of a man who kept his desk the way he kept everything else. Becky stood off to the side with her tablet, ready to take notes. The voices on the conference call represented the other major players in the operation. Sector leads from the north, east, and west clearing zones. A supply coordinator, a woman whose voice Foster didn't recognize, but whose introduction identified her as a part of the medical team working with Dr. Hopkins at the hospital. "Let's start with the head count," Foster said. Brooks picked it up. He opened a folder in front of him and looked at the numbers, though Foster suspected the man already had them committed to memory. "We're still working through a full census. Teams are registering survivors as they come in from clearing operations, and we've got check-in points at the stadium, Nellis, and 4 other sites across the city. Based on what we have so far, we're estimating between 12 and 15,000 survivors across the entire Las Vegas metropolitan area," Brooks said. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of people thinking, but the quiet of people absorbing something that hurt. Foster had expected a low number. He had known, on some level, that the math was never going to be kind. But hearing it spoken out loud in a room full of people who had spent the past 2 months fighting to save every life they could reach made it land differently than he had prepared for. Hanson uncrossed his arms and sat forward. 12 to 15,000, Hanson said. Out of how many? Pre-outbreak population of the metro area was roughly 2 million permanent residents, Brooks said. On top of that, you had tourists. On any given day, Las Vegas had somewhere between 200 and 300,000 visitors in the city. Most of those people didn't make it out of their hotel rooms since this nightmare kicked off in the middle of the night. I suspect a few managed to get out before things got too bad, but it couldn't have been many. So we're talking about a city of 2 million people, and we've got maybe 15,000 left, Parker said. That's the estimate, and I want to walk through why, because the number makes more sense when you break it down, even if it doesn't make it easier to hear, Brooks said. He looked at his notes, though again the gesture seemed more habitual than necessary. The virus itself accounted for the first and largest wave. Roughly 40% of the general population carries A-type blood. In a metro area of 2 million, that's approximately 800,000 people who are going to turn regardless of anything else. No bite required. They got sick, they ran a severe fever for 72 hours, and then they died and came back. And the critical part is that they all turned within the same window. You didn't have 800,000 people turning one at a time over a period of weeks. You had them turning in a concentrated burst, flooding the city with fast-moving ghouls all at once. Foster had known the numbers in a general sense, had understood the scale of what the virus had done from the moment his team had arrived and seen the streets. But hearing it laid out with this precision, in a room full of people who had lived through it, gave the numbers a weight that general understanding didn't carry. 800,000. That was the population of a major city, gone in 3 days, and every one of them had come back hungry. The woman from the medical team spoke up through the speaker. From the hospital's perspective, that first wave was impossible to manage. We had patients coming in with what looked like severe flu symptoms, a lot of whom we admitted because they were too sick to discharge. Once the first one turned, the rest followed close behind. Most hospitals were completely overrun before anybody knew what was happening. Brooks nodded, even though the woman couldn't see him. That first wave triggered the second, which was the attacks. 800,000 ghouls moving through a city that had no idea what was happening. The casinos were death traps. You had thousands of people packed into buildings designed to keep them inside. Limited exits, no weapons, no warning. Hotels were the same. People were caught sleeping, eating, sitting at slot machines. Most of them never had a chance, Brooks said. He paused and let that sit for a moment before continuing. The initial attacks killed another 1 million or more in the first few days. The numbers are impossible to pin down exactly. But when you look at the density of the population, the layout of the buildings, and the speed of those first ghouls, 1 million is a conservative estimate. What about people who tried to leave? Mike asked. Some made it. The ones who moved fast in the first hours, before the highways locked up, had the best chance. But the interstates turned into parking lots within a few hours. I-15, US 95, every major route out of the city. Once the road stopped moving, people were trapped in their vehicles. We've seen the aftermath on some of the highway approaches. It's not something I'd recommend looking at, Brooks said. The room was heavy now. Foster could feel it in the posture of every person at the table, the way people had stopped fidgeting and shifting in their chairs and were just sitting with it. And then there's the long tail, Brooks said. The people who survived the first wave and the attacks but didn't make it through the weeks that followed. Starvation, dehydration, injuries that couldn't be treated, illness, people who were trapped in buildings without enough food or water, people who tried to move between locations to find supplies and got caught in the open. Without organized rescue efforts, and those didn't start until Captain Foster's team arrived, survival was entirely dependent on 2 things: luck and location. If you happened to be in a place with enough food, enough water, and enough structural integrity to keep the ghouls out, you had a chance. If you didn't, you were on borrowed time. Mike was staring at his map, but his eyes weren't reading it. Foster recognized the look. Mike had been on the radio through all of it, broadcasting into the dark, talking to a city that was dying around him. He had heard voices come and go, people who called in once and never called again. The number Brooks was laying out wasn't abstract for any of them, but for Mike, it carried the weight of every voice he had heard go silent. "The hotel we cleared this morning," Hansen said quietly. "Peter's group. 6 people on the top floor of a 4-story building. They fought their way up from the lobby, lost people along the way, and lived on hotel food for weeks, and that was one of the success stories." Nobody responded to that. There wasn't anything to add. Brooks closed the folder. "It's been over 2 months. The math is brutal, but it tracks. We may find more survivors as the clearing operations continue, but I want to be honest with everyone in this room and on this call. I don't expect the number to change dramatically. We might gain another 1,000 or 2 from buildings we haven't reached yet, but the people who are going to survive without help have already found ways to do it. And the people who needed help." He let the sentence trail off. He didn't need to finish it. Foster sat with the number, 12 to 15,000 out of 2 million, less than 1%. He thought about the farms he had just visited, the fields where Ruth and her people were putting seeds in the ground. He thought about the wall of cars stretching around the perimeter of the city. He thought about the clearing teams working block by block, building by building, opening doors to find out what was behind them. All of that effort, all of that risk, all of that work to protect and provide for the fraction of a city that had managed to hold on. It wasn't a failure. It was the reality of what had happened, and no amount of effort could change what had already been lost. The only thing they could do now was make sure the people who were still alive stayed that way. Every decision from this point forward had to be built on that foundation. The silence held for a long moment. Foster let it. Some things needed room to breathe before you moved past them. Rushing to the next topic would have felt like stepping over something that deserved acknowledgement. He looked around the table and saw that same understanding on every face. Even Parker, who was usually the first to push forward, was sitting still with it. One of the sector leads on the call spoke up, pulling the conversation forward with the careful tone of someone who understood the weight of what had just been discussed, but also knew the meeting had to continue. "What's the food situation looking like?" Foster took this one. "We've got teams redirecting to food storage locations as of today. Grocery stores, restaurant supply warehouses, hotel kitchens, any large retail location that might be holding inventory. The clearing teams are going to prioritize those structures and get full inventories done. Once we know what's in the city, we can build a distribution plan and set rations." "The farms on the northeast side are in the ground," Parker added. "Winter crops going in now, greenhouses under construction. But we're looking at a couple of months before any of that starts producing. In the meantime, it's all prepackaged. Canned goods, dry goods, whatever's been sealed tight enough to last," Foster said. "The desert climate has actually helped us on that front. Less humidity means less spoilage in buildings that lost power. But it's not a crisis yet, only because we haven't hit the point where demand outpaces what we've found. That changes fast if we don't stay on top of it. I want every major food source in this city accounted for within the next 2 weeks." Brooks made a note on his pad. Becky's fingers moved across her tablet. "We've got some stores inside the stadium that we can spare if you need it," Brooks said. "We managed to pull a good amount of goods before things went to hell out there. It's been managed carefully, but it's a finite resource. I'll have Becky compile our numbers and get them added to the citywide inventory." "Appreciated," Foster said. The practical weight of it settled over the room. 15,000 people to feed, a city's worth of scattered food supplies to catalog, and a timeline measured in months before the farms could take any of the pressure off. It was manageable if they were disciplined about it, but the margin for waste or miscalculation was thin. A voice on the conference call, one of the sector leads, broke the brief silence with a tone that was more blunt than diplomatic. "All of this matters, but food isn't going to matter much if we can't keep people safe. I think we need to talk about security." Foster nodded. "Agreed. Let's get into it." Chapter 6. The mood in the room shifted as the conversation moved from what they had lost to what they were doing to protect what remained. Foster could feel the change at the table. The survivor numbers had put weight on everyone's shoulders, and the food discussion had added to it, but security was something they could act on. It was concrete. It was work that could be measured and improved, and the room leaned into it. Brooks started with the perimeter. The vehicle wall is continuous around the habitable zones of the city. Full coverage, bumper to bumper, with metal sheeting reinforcing the outward-facing surfaces. It's the most significant defensive asset we have, and it's held up well so far. But it's not without problems, Brooks said. He stood and moved to the map on the wall behind the table, pointing to sections as he spoke. "We've got a few areas on the south and southwest sides where the barrier is thinner than I'd like. The vehicles there are smaller, sedans and compacts, which means less mass and lower profile. We've been working to supplement those sections with additional sheeting and bracing, but it's an ongoing project. The tires still need to be braced along large portions of the wall. A big enough group pushing against any section could shove the vehicles backward if they aren't anchored from behind," Brooks said. "We talked about that on the drive over," Foster said. "The bracing needs to happen, but I'm not pulling patrol teams to do it. We're already short on patrols as it is." "What about manpower on the wall itself?" one of the sector leads asked through the speaker. "We've got guards posted at intervals, but there are long stretches with nobody watching." "Mike's working on that," Foster said. "He's got a group of retirees from one of the homes who have been calling into the station asking to help. We're going to get them set up as spotters on the sections where we don't have enough bodies. They can hold a radio and keep their eyes open. It's not a fighting force, but it fills the gaps." "Every set of eyes helps," Brooks said. He made a note on his pad and moved on, his finger tracing the interior of the perimeter on the map. "Inside the wall, we've got roving patrol teams working the streets on regular schedules, 3 shifts rotating every 8 hours. Each team covers an assigned zone and reports in at checkpoints along their route. Their primary job is handling any ghouls that turn up, whether that's stragglers wandering in from unchecked buildings or creatures that find their way through gaps in the perimeter. So far, the patrol teams have been effective. Response times are reasonable, and the interior streets are as clear as we can keep them given what we're working with," Brooks said. "The teams have gotten good at it," one of the sector leads added through the speaker. "Early on, we had people freezing up, not knowing how to handle contact. That doesn't happen anymore. Everybody on patrol has been through enough situations to know what they're doing. The bigger challenge is fatigue, same people running the same routes day after day. We need to build in rotation so nobody burns out." "How many teams are we running total?" Hansen asked. 12 active patrol teams across all sectors, mix of soldiers and trained civilians. We'd like more, but we're pulling from the same pool of people who are also doing clearing operations, construction, and supply runs, Brooks said. Foster nodded. It was the same resource problem they hit on every front. Not enough people to do everything that needed doing, which meant every decision about where to put bodies was a decision about what to leave short-handed. "The third layer is the curfew," Brooks said. "Strict enforcement, no exceptions. Everyone off the streets after dark." "That one is non-negotiable," Foster said. "We're only 30% cleared structurally. That means 70% of the buildings in this city have not been fully checked. At any point, a door could fail, a window could give out, and whatever is inside comes out. During the day, the patrols can respond. People on the street can see what's coming and react. But at night, a ghoul comes out of a building and stumbles into a civilian who doesn't see it until it's on top of them, and that's how we lose someone for no reason." "It only takes one," Parker said. "One creature gets loose in the dark, finds somebody who isn't ready, and suddenly we've got a bite victim. And then we've got a bigger problem if they bleed out before anybody knows they're down." The room absorbed that. A runner could set off a chain reaction amongst the survivors. One encounter in the dark could cascade into something worse if they weren't careful. "The curfew stays as is," Foster said. "Until we're fully cleared, nobody is on the streets after dark without authorization." No one argued the point. The curfew had been one of the first rules put in place once the perimeter was established, and in the weeks since, it had become accepted as a fact of life. People understood the reasoning. Nobody wanted to be out on the streets after dark in a city where 7 out of 10 buildings still hadn't been checked. "Which brings us to the timeline," Brooks said, returning to his seat. He opened to another page in his notepad and looked at the figures. "At our current pace and manpower, it's going to take at least another month to fully clear every building inside the perimeter. And I want to be precise about what clear means in this context. We're talking about confirming that a structure is empty of active ghouls. We are not talking about making it livable, restoring utilities, or doing anything beyond verifying that nothing inside is going to come out and hurt someone. Livability is a separate project entirely, and it comes after. The commercial buildings are going to eat most of that time," another sector lead said through the speaker. "The houses go quick. Most of them are single-story, a few rooms in and out. But the hotels, the shopping centers, the warehouse districts, those are multi-day jobs with teams of 8 or more, and we've barely touched some of them. A month is optimistic if we're also redirecting teams to food inventory," the first sector lead added. "It is," Foster said, "but both have to happen. We'll manage the overlap as best we can. If a clearing team hits a grocery store or a warehouse during their sweep, they do the inventory on the spot. 2 birds." Brooks made a note and moved on. "The last topic before we get to Parker's point is medical," Brooks said. The woman from Dr. Hopkins' team spoke up through the speaker. Her voice carried the measured calm of someone who spent her days dealing with problems that didn't have easy answers. "Dr. Hopkins has her floor at the hospital partially operational. She held that section during the outbreak, which, given what happened in most hospitals, is remarkable. Most of the hospitals in the city became war zones in the first days. You had patients dying from the virus and reanimating on the wards, in close quarters with staff and other patients who had no idea what was happening. By the time anyone understood what was going on, the buildings were overrun. Hopkins saw it coming faster than most. She sealed off her floor, barricaded the stairwells, and kept her people alive, while the rest of the building fell apart around her. She lost staff and patients in the process, but she held the line." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Right now, she's running with a skeleton crew, but they can handle trauma, basic surgery, wound care, and illness. The equipment on her floor is functional, and she's been scavenging from the rest of the hospital for supplies when the clearing teams give her access to additional floors. The bigger issue is capacity. If we get a mass casualty event, one patrol team ambushed, a building collapse during clearing, anything that puts more than a handful of serious injuries in front of her at once, we don't have the beds or the staff to handle it. How many medical personnel do we have across the city? Foster asked. Between the hospital, the stadium, and what we've found scattered through the survivor population, we're looking at roughly 12 doctors, maybe 20 nurses and paramedics combined. For 15,000 people, that's thin. It's very thin, Brooks said. We have a few medical staff inside the stadium as well. 2 doctors and several nurses who have been managing healthcare for the residents here. They're capable, but they're stretched. Hansen leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 30-some medical professionals for 15,000 people. That's one for every 400 or 500, Hansen said. Which is why I want to propose something, the woman on the call said. Cross-training. We start teaching basic medical treatment to as many people as we can. First aid, wound care, infection management, triage fundamentals. We can't train surgeons in a classroom, but we can train people to stabilize a patient, stop bleeding, set a bone, and recognize the signs of something that needs a doctor's attention. If we spread that knowledge across the population, we take pressure off the medical teams and we reduce the number of treatable injuries that turn into deaths because nobody nearby knew what to do. I think that's one of the best ideas we've had all day, Mike said. Foster looked around the table and saw agreement on every face. Brooks was already writing it down. How fast can you put a program together? Foster asked. Give me a week to develop the curriculum and identify trainers. After that, we can start running classes at multiple sites. The stadium, Nellis, and a couple of the larger residential clusters. Rotate people through on a schedule so it doesn't pull too many bodies off other assignments at once, the woman said. Do it, Foster said. Coordinate with Becky on scheduling and locations. Becky looked up from her tablet and gave a nod. The room settled for a moment, the defense and medical discussions feeling like they had reached a natural pause. Foster was about to move toward wrapping up when Parker straightened in his chair. He had been listening and contributing throughout the meeting, but Foster recognized the look. Parker had something on his mind that he had been sitting on, waiting for the right moment. There's one more thing we need to talk about, Parker said. The room turned to him. Everything we've discussed today, the wall, the patrols, the curfew, the clearing operations, all of it is built around one threat, zombies. And that makes sense, because that's been the threat since day 0. But it's not the only threat we're going to face. He paused, letting the statement sit for a beat. We need to start thinking about people, not our people, other people, raiders, hostile groups, anyone out there who sees a functioning city with food, water, power, and walls, and decides they want what we have, because sooner or later, someone is going to come looking. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been during the survivor count. That silence had been grief. This one was discomfort. The idea of defending against the living carried a weight that was distinct from everything they had been dealing with. For 2 months, the enemy had been simple. Ghouls didn't plan, didn't strategize, didn't negotiate. They just came, and you dealt with them. People were a different problem entirely, and everyone in the room understood that on a level they hadn't wanted to think about until now. Foster looked at Parker and gave a single nod. Lay it out for us, Parker. Chapter 7. Parker's words hung in the room for a few seconds before one of the sector leads on. The call broke the silence. With all due respect, I think we've got bigger problems to deal with right now than hypothetical raiders, the man said. We've got armed patrols, a wall around the city, and enough firepower to make anyone think twice. Who's going to look at what we've built and decide it's worth picking a fight? Another voice on the call agreed. He's right. We're not some defenseless camp in the middle of nowhere. We've got structure, we've got numbers, and we've got soldiers. The threat from the dead is real and present. The threat from people is theoretical. Parker listened without interrupting, letting them finish. When the line went quiet, he leaned forward and rested his forearms on the table. I hear you, and I'm not saying you're wrong about what we have. We do have structure, we do have numbers. But hoping that what you have is enough to scare people off is not the same thing as being prepared for what happens when it doesn't, Parker said. He looked around the table, then spoke toward the conference phone so the people on the call could hear him clearly. Right now, we've got about 15,000 people in this city. How many of them can fight? And I don't mean soldiers, I mean civilians. The people working the farms, the construction crews, the folks sorting inventory at Nellis. If something happens, if someone shows up at that wall with numbers and weapons and bad intentions, what do those people do? Because right now, most of them are carrying tools they barely know how to swing. We've taught them enough to handle a slow-moving zombie, but that's a different thing than defending yourself against a person who's trying to kill you. The pushback on the call had gone quiet. Foster watched Parker work the room. The kid had come a long way from the private who had barely slept during those first frantic weeks. He still had that intensity, but now it was aimed at something beyond the next mission. I'm not talking about firearms training for everyone, Parker continued. That's a resource issue and an ammunition issue. We don't have enough of either to be handing out guns and running target practice. But hand-to-hand combat, basic self-defense, how to actually use the weapons people are already carrying that we can do. Spears, bats, pipes, bladed tools. Most of the civilians in this city walk around with something in their hand already. They should know how to use it against something that fights back. He's got a point, Hansen said. The clearing teams we've been sending out, the civilians on those teams have gotten decent at putting down creatures, but that's because the creatures don't dodge. They don't block. They don't think. A person does all of those things. Parker nodded and kept going. Beyond training, we should be manufacturing weapons, organized production, not just scavenging. The hardware stores and machine shops in this city have everything we need: steel, wood, tools, welding equipment. We can turn out spears, reinforced clubs, bladed weapons, whatever the situation calls for. Every person in this city should have something on them that they know how to use. And we should have stockpiles at every major location: the wall, the stadium, Nellis, the residential clusters. If something happens and people need to arm up fast, the weapons should already be there waiting, Parker said. The gladiators at the Colosseum have been doing something like that on a smaller scale, Mike said. Magnus and his guys have been making weapons from whatever they can get their hands on. If we gave them the resources and the space, they could probably help organize the production. Good, get them involved, Foster said. Brooks had been listening with the particular stillness of a man who was weighing an argument on its merits rather than its popularity. He tapped his pen against the notepad once. It's not an unreasonable proposal, Brooks said. The infrastructure for production exists. It's a question of allocating the manpower to set it up. I'll take that as a yes from the captain, Parker said. The faintest trace of a smile crossed Brooks's face before it disappeared back behind the professional mask. Parker sat back in his chair for a moment, and Foster could see him gathering himself for the next part. Whatever was coming, Parker had saved it for a reason. There's one more thing, and it's the one nobody in this room wants to think about, Parker said. He waited until he had the full attention of everyone at the table and on the call before he continued. Los Angeles is roughly 270 miles southwest of us. It's connected to Las Vegas by a straight shot up Interstate 15. Before the outbreak, the LA metro area had a population of somewhere around 20 million people. He let that number sit for a moment. 20 million. Even if you cut that in half for people who fled, people who died without turning, people who made it out, you're still looking at millions of zombies concentrated in one metropolitan area. And between them and us, there's nothing. Desert, highway, and a whole lot of open road. The room had gone still. Foster could feel the shift. The earlier pushback about raiders had carried the comfortable energy of people dismissing a problem they didn't want to deal with. This was different. This was math, and the math was terrifying. If anything ever pushes that population northeast, if they follow someone escaping the city, or, hell, if they chase a dog running away, anything that gets them moving in our direction, they hit I-15 and they follow it straight to our front door. The wall we built is impressive. It'll hold against the kinds of numbers we've been dealing with. But a fraction of what's sitting in LA would roll over it like it wasn't there, Parker said. Nobody spoke for a long moment. One of the sector leads let out a breath that was audible through the speaker. Foster looked at the map on the wall behind Brooks. From this room, the city they had fought to secure looked manageable, a defined area with boundaries and structure and people working every corner of it. But beyond those boundaries, the world was still out there, and the world was full of things they couldn't control. Mike stared at the conference phone like it might offer an answer, then shook his head slowly. I've been broadcasting for 2 months, and I never once thought about what's sitting down the road in LA. Not once, Mike said. That's because we've had enough to deal with right here, Hansen said. But Parker's right. We can't ignore it just because we haven't had to face it yet. So what do we do about it? Foster asked, directing the question to Parker. We watch for it, Parker said. Observation posts in the hills and elevated positions overlooking the interstate approaches. Get eyes on the road south so we have as much warning as possible if something starts moving our way. If we can set up unmanned cameras, even better. Solar-powered units that feed back to a monitoring station. As long as we've got power, we can keep them running. That's doable, Brooks said, which brings up a good point. Power. He turned to address the room and the call at the same time. We have a shift's worth of personnel from the power plant, people who were working there before the outbreak and managed to survive. The good news, and this is one of the biggest advantages we have in this city, is that the local power generation is hydroelectric, Hoover Dam. It doesn't require fuel deliveries to keep running. No diesel, no coal, no natural gas. As long as water flows through the turbines and we have people who know how to maintain the systems, we can keep the lights on. That's power for the wall spotlights, the medical equipment at the hospital, the communication systems, the monitoring stations Parker is proposing. Everything. How stable is the staffing? Foster asked. Stable enough for now. We've got enough people to run the plant in shifts, and they've been training additional personnel as backup. It's not deep bench, but it's functional. My recommendation is that we treat those power plant workers as critical assets. They don't go on clearing operations, they don't pull patrol duty, they don't do anything that puts them at risk. Losing even one of them would hurt us, Brooks said. Agreed, Foster said. Put together a list of anyone else in the city who falls into that category. Power plant staff, doctors, anyone with a skill set we can't afford to lose. Those people get assigned to protected roles. Brooks wrote it down, and for a moment the only sound in the room was his pen moving across the notepad. When he finished, he looked up and straightened in his chair. All right, I think we have a clear picture of where we stand and what needs to happen next. Let me start assigning timelines and responsibilities, Brooks said. He began listing items, ticking through the topics they had covered with the organized efficiency that defined him. The perimeter bracing, the wall spotters, the food inventory, the medical cross-training, the weapons manufacturing, the observation posts. He had it all cataloged, and he moved through it with the confidence of a man accustomed to turning meetings into action. Then he stopped. His pen hovered over the notepad, and he looked up at Foster. Something shifted in his expression, the formality giving way to something more deliberate. Actually, Brooks said, he set the pen down. I've been running this stadium since the outbreak, kept it locked down, kept the people inside alive, kept things organized. I'm proud of that work. But what's happened outside these walls, the clearing operations, the party bus runs, the rescues, the wall, the farms, the patrols, all of it, that was you, Captain Foster. You and your people built this. You earned the authority to lead this city more than I have. The room went quiet. Brooks held Foster's gaze, and there was nothing political in it. No maneuvering, no performance. It was one officer recognizing what another had done and making a decision about what that meant going forward. I'm not stepping back from the stadium. My people are here, and I'll keep running this operation. But when it comes to the city as a whole, the decisions that affect everyone, that should be you, Brooks said. Foster sat with it for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man who needed the recognition, and he wasn't the kind who would refuse it out of false modesty when the situation called for someone to lead. He gave Brooks a nod that carried the weight of the moment without turning it into a speech. I appreciate that, Captain. We'll do this together, Foster said. The moment settled across the room without anyone needing to acknowledge it further. Hansen gave a small nod that only Foster would have noticed. Parker sat back in his chair with an expression that said what he was thinking without requiring words. Mike looked between the two captains and then down at his map, a faint smile crossing his face. Becky made a note on her tablet. Brooks picked his pen back up. Then, let's reconvene in a couple of days. Give everyone time to get their assignments moving. I want progress reports on the perimeter bracing, the food inventory, and the observation post scouting by the time we sit back down," Brooks said. Foster looked around the table one more time. Hanson, Parker, Mike, Brooks, Becky. The voices on the conference call. These were the people holding a city together, and the work ahead of them was enormous. But for the first time since they had started, the work had shape. It had structure. It had a plan. Let's get to it then. Chapter 8. The meeting had broken 15 minutes ago, and Foster's core group had drifted through the stadium together. None of them in any particular hurry to get anywhere. The hallways were busy with the daily rhythm of the stadium's residents, people moving between living quarters and work areas, carrying supplies, talking in small groups. Foster led his men through it without a destination in mind, until they found a stairwell that took them up to an overlook above the infield. They stepped out onto a wide concourse that wrapped around the upper level, the open air hitting them after the enclosed hallways below. The afternoon sun came in at an angle through the stadium's retractable roof, which sat partially open, flooding the interior with natural light. Foster walked to the railing and looked down. The football field had been transformed. Greenhouses occupied a large section of the turf, their metal and glass frames catching the sunlight in long, bright lines. People moved between them with purpose, carrying flats of seedlings, adjusting irrigation lines, checking the structures for gaps. Beyond the greenhouses, open sections of the field had been converted into garden plots, the soil dark and turned, rows of green visible where early plantings had taken hold. A supply area had been set up near the far end zone, pallets of materials stacked and organized, a small crew sorting through them. And on the open stretch of field nearest the 50-yard line, a pickup game of flag football was happening. Two teams, maybe 8 or 9 people per side, were running plays on the grass. Adults mostly, with a handful of younger survivors mixed in. Someone threw a pass that sailed high and long, and a woman sprinted under it, hauled it in over her shoulder, and kept running until she was tackled out of bounds by someone who had clearly forgotten it was flag football. The group erupted in laughter and argument in equal measure, voices carrying up through the open air to where the soldiers stood. Foster put his hands on the railing and watched. Beside him, Hanson leaned against the barrier with his arms crossed. Sullivan and Cooper stood a few feet down, both of them looking at the field with expressions that were hard to read. Thomas had his hands in his pockets, his eyes moving between the greenhouses and the football game like he was trying to take all of it in at once. Parker stood slightly apart from the group, his forearms resting on the railing, his gaze fixed on the game below. Nobody said anything for a while. The sounds from the field drifted up to them, laughter and shouting, and the occasional thud of a body hitting turf. The greenhouse workers moved in and out of the structures with the easy repetition of a routine. Somewhere below the concourse, a child's voice echoed off the concrete, followed by the sound of small feet running. This was the first time any of them had stopped, not paused between missions, not rested before the next push, but actually stopped. The clearing operations, the party bus runs into swarms of thousands, breaching hotels blind and fighting through hallways. The rescues that went right and the ones that went sideways. All of it had been a relentless forward motion that hadn't left room for standing still. And now they were standing still, looking down at people who were living, not surviving, not waiting to be rescued, living. Sullivan was the one who said it. "Is it crazy that all of us made it?" Sullivan asked. The question hung in the air. Nobody answered right away because the answer required thinking about something they had all been careful not to think about too directly: the math, the odds. The number of times any one of them should have been the one who didn't come back. "It's not crazy," Thomas said. "It's statistically absurd." Hanson let out a short laugh. "Leave it to Thomas to make surviving the apocalypse sound like a math problem," Hanson said. "I'm serious," Thomas said. "Think about what we did. The party bus runs alone, driving into herds of thousands with nothing but music and a bus. The hotel clearings where we were going in, blind on every floor. The rescue at the casino where the front entrance was sitting wide open, and the whole ground floor was packed. Every one of those situations had a real chance of killing someone, and we did them over and over for weeks. The odds of the entire unit walking away from all of that without a single KIA are, He trailed off, shaking his head. It doesn't happen. And yet, here we are, Cooper said. Here we are, Sullivan agreed. Hansen turned toward Parker with a grin that said he was about to start something. You want to talk about odds? Let's talk about Parker jumping down into the pit of zombies down in the tunnels to save Cooper's ass, Hansen said. Can we please not talk about that? Cooper pleaded. Come on, it was Parker's finest moment, Hansen retorted. Finest moment in the tunnels. I've had finer moments, Parker said. Oh yeah, name one, Hansen challenged. Parker thought about it for a moment, talking to himself before finally having an aha moment. There was that supercenter where I found the steaks that a manager had hidden in the back freezer. The soldiers all looked around to each other before breaking into a fit of laughter at the absurdity of it. The laughter came easy, the kind that lived in the space between relief and disbelief. They traded moments back and forth, each one pulling something from the past 2 months that the others either remembered clearly or had tried to forget. Cooper brought up a stairwell clearing where Thomas had been point man, and a creature had come through a door that was supposed to be locked. Thomas countered with the time Cooper had tripped over a body in a hotel hallway and accidentally put his elbow through a wall, which had drawn every zombie on the floor toward the sound. Sullivan recalled a night patrol where he and Hansen had gotten turned around in the dark and spent 20 minutes navigating by the sound of Mike's radio broadcast, bleeding out of a storefront. The stories weren't heroic in the way that word usually meant. They were messy and close and full of the kind of details that only mattered to the people who had been there. But underneath all of them was the same truth that Thomas had put into numbers. None of them should have walked away clean, and all of them had. Thomas leaned on the railing and looked down at the football game. The players had reset and were running another play, someone juking hard to the left and getting their flag pulled at the last second. The argument that followed was loud and animated and completely pointless, and it was the best sound in the world. 6 months from now, this place is going to look different, Thomas said. The farms will be producing, the buildings will be cleared, the wall will be reinforced. If we keep at it, this city could actually work. A year from now, it'll be even better, Cooper said. A year from now, I'll be retired, Hansen said. Retired where? Sullivan asked. You going to move into one of the penthouse suites on the Strip? Don't think I haven't thought about it, Hansen said. The laughter came again, and it settled into something quieter. Parker hadn't said much through any of it. He was still leaning on the railing, watching the game below, and Foster could see that the kid was letting himself have this, not analyzing it, not planning the next move, not running through scenarios in his head, just standing with the men he had served beside and watching people play football on a field that used to host a college team and now hosted greenhouses and flag football and something that looked a whole lot like a future. Hansen nudged Parker with his elbow. You're quiet over there. What are you thinking about? Hansen asked. Parker was still for a moment. Then he straightened up from the railing and looked at the group. I'm glad we all made it, Parker said. That was all. No elaboration, no follow-up. Coming from Parker, it was enough. Hansen clapped him on the shoulder and left it there. Foster stood with his men and let the moment exist. He was proud of them, proud of what they had done together, proud of who they had become in the process. Every one of them had been pushed past what anyone should have been asked to endure, and every one of them had come out the other side still standing. That meant something. It meant everything. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where the part of him that never fully rested kept its vigil, there was a thread that wouldn't quite let go, a sense that the quiet was temporary. Not because anything was wrong, but because the world didn't stay quiet for long anymore. Footsteps behind them broke through, measured and deliberate. Foster turned to see Brooks walking toward the group with a stride that said, this wasn't casual. Captain Foster, got a minute? I need to borrow you, Brooks said. Foster looked at his men. They were still at the railing, still watching the game, still having the moment they had earned. He didn't want to pull them out of it. I'll catch up with you all, Foster said. Hansen gave him a nod. The others barely looked up, still absorbed in the scene below. Foster turned and followed Brooks back inside. They walked through the concourse and down a flight of stairs to a hallway that led to a communications room deeper in the stadium's infrastructure. The room was small and functional, outfitted with radio equipment and a phone system that had been patched into the broader network they had built over the past weeks. A handset sat off the hook on the desk, the line open. Seattle, Brooks said. They asked for you specifically." Foster picked up the handset and brought it to his ear. "This is Foster." Two voices came through, one after the other. Foster didn't recognize either of them. "Captain Foster, my name is Clint, and I've got Gad here with me. We're operating out of Seattle," the first voice said. "Captain Brooks has been keeping us in the loop on what you've been doing out there in Vegas," Gad said. "We've been coordinating with his team for a few weeks now." Foster glanced at Brooks, who stood near the door with his arms folded. Brooks gave a small nod that said he would explain the details later. "All right," Foster said. "What can I do for you?" "First, we want you to know that what you've built out there is remarkable," Clint said. "Brooks has walked us through the clearing operations, the infrastructure, the wall, the farms, all of it. You took a city that was gone and brought it back. That's not a small thing." "I appreciate that," Foster said. "But I'm guessing this call isn't just to say congratulations." There was a brief pause on the line, the kind that came before the conversation changed direction. "It's not," Clint said. "We've got a situation developing in Kansas. I'm not going to go into the full picture over the phone, but it's significant. And it's the kind of thing that needs people who know what they're doing." "We could use your help, Foster," Gad said. "You and your team." Foster leaned against the desk and let that sit for a moment. Kansas, hundreds of miles from here, in a part of the country he hadn't thought about since all of this started. Two men he had never spoken to before were asking him to leave the city he had spent 2 months pouring everything into. Building the walls, clearing the streets, organizing the people, setting up the farms and the patrols and the systems that would keep 15,000 survivors alive. The idea of walking away from that was complicated in a way that simple orders wouldn't have been. But he also knew what he had built. The clearing teams would keep clearing, the farms would keep growing, the patrols would keep running their routes, and the wall would keep standing, and Brooks would keep the stadium in order. Kyle and Damon and Hiroshi would keep doing the work on the ground. Mike would keep broadcasting. Ruth would keep planting. The whole operation had been built so that it didn't depend on one man standing at the center of it. That had always been the point, even if Foster hadn't realized it until this moment. "How soon?" Foster asked. "Soon," Clint said. "We'll get you the details in the next day or two. Just wanted to give you a heads up so you can start thinking about it." "I'll think about it," Foster said. "That's all we're asking," Gad said. The call ended, and Foster set the handset back in the cradle. He looked at Brooks, who hadn't moved from his spot near the door. "How long have you been talking to them?" Foster asked. "A few weeks. They've been keeping in touch with the stadiums that were set up for the VIPs, and they have been very keen on hearing about what you've been doing here," Brooks said. "So how do we stack up against the other cities? I hope we're in the top 5 at least." Brooks stayed silent for a beat, which put Foster on edge a bit. Finally, Brooks broke the silence. "Outside of Seattle, which took the entire weight of the military to clear, Las Vegas is the only city that is standing and thriving." Foster was stunned into silence. While he was proud of what they had been able to do in Vegas, it was discouraging to hear that they were losing the war against the dead on every other front. "Becky informed me that the chef is preparing you and your men a special dinner, and that it should be ready for you at the top of the hour. It'll be in Skybox 11. "We'll be there, thank you, Captain." Brooks nodded and headed off, leaving his counterpart alone in the office. Foster let everything settle, then turned and looked back down the hallway, toward the concourse, toward the overlook, where his men were still standing at the railing. He couldn't see them from here, but he could picture it. Hanson leaning with his arms crossed, cracking a joke. Sullivan and Cooper arguing about something that didn't matter. Thomas thinking 6 moves ahead. Parker watching the football game with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had given everything he had and could finally stand still long enough to see what it had built. The weight of what they had accomplished settled over him, and it brought a smile to his face. He knew that there was work to be done, but for the moment, he was going to savor their victory. The end.